Hello and welcome to ESL Revolution, everyone. I am your content creator and professor, Dr. B. Welcome back to the channel. I know it's been a while since I've spoken to you, but I am back. It's okay. Everything's fine. So I want to give a big shout out to two people today. First of all, happy birthday to my wife, Hyunji. You're getting older. That's all I can say. Welcome to the club. But happy birthday today. The second is I want to shout out to Muyang. She's a family friend of ours who actually gave us this topic in the YouTube channel as well. It's something that we've been talking about through Facebook and stuff like that over the course of the last little while. So she'd actually asked me to do a topic in this with the channel, and so here we go. So the channel, the topic today is actually on international marriage. It's something that she's been thinking about a lot. She is married to an American. They live in Malta presently because he is a school counselor, international school counselor, and they're actually going to be moving back to Korea within the next few months, hopefully. With regard to COVID, we're not sure, but hopefully they'll be back soon. And it's something that's been on her mind a lot because she has a lot of international marriage friends, and she actually wants to start a YouTube channel to talk about the issues. So she told me, she asked me if I could touch on this. And so I'm going to do that for you today as my students, because this is yet another way for you to kind of get to know me a little bit as well. Even though we're at the end of the semester, this for 2020 in term one, other students will come into the channel. They'll be able to see these videos as well. So the first thing I want to say is just two caveats. First of all, I am in no way a licensed professional in this regard. I don't have any kind of advanced degree or any kind of degree in psychology or anything like that. What I'm going to be giving you is simply my own experience, I guess, is the only way that I can say that. So it's not professional experience by any stretch, but that's the first caveat. The second one is that I'm not in any way advocating for you in the future to do anything like this. If you do, great. If not, great. It doesn't matter to me. This is just simply a way for you to get to know me a little better. So there's two big things that I want to touch on, which will probably segue into other things. But the two big things I want to talk about are the issue of cultural DNA and how that relates to an international marriage. But also I want to touch on my own experience, the good things and the bad things, and at least provide you with a I think a balanced way of understanding what has gone on in my life over the last 13 years. So here we go. So the first thing, cultural DNA. Let me explain what this is, because it's an important area to be considering when you are getting into an international marriage. And of course, this is something that I too had to understand once I'd made that decision. Like once my wife and I were kind of on that track, it was an important conversation that I had to have with myself as well as with her. And we're going to get to that. So what is cultural DNA? Well, as DNA is in our body, right, the actual biological material, DNA, that gives us an imprint of who we are. It gives us, how much hair we have, what color is it, what color are our eyes, are we big, are we small, are we short, are we, all of that sort of thing. It gives our body, our physical body, the parameters by which we live by. Cultural DNA works similarly. in that each one of us exist in a particular culture at a particular time in a particular place. And because of that, we are going to see the world, our world, in a particular way. And that cultural DNA has an impact on how we understand not just the people that we interact with, but the wider world culture generally. Let me give you an example to help illustrate what I mean by this. Between Canada and Korea, there are many different things, different ways of seeing the world. So one of the things that quite often comes up in my conversations with my wife, because we're both teachers, is in fact the cultural DNA of teaching. The teaching in Korea and the learning in Korea is very different from the teaching and learning in Canada. Let me give you an example. An example of an example. So is that an example squared? I don't know. Anyway, in Korea, we have typically, although not always, because there's always rules to the exception, right? Typically, we have in Korea a teacher-focused, memory-based system of education. Now, I'm not saying that that is always across the board, but typically in kind of the historical framework of education in Korea, that is what it's been. Even now, in the 21st century, that memory-based learning is still very much a part of the way Koreans study. Actually, a point of reference to this is the KSAT, right? You'll spend years and years and years studying for one single test, which will determine what you do for the rest of your life. It will determine what university do you go to, which determines what job you go to, which may or may not determine whether or not you get a job. It might determine as to whether or not you say single or married. It may determine whether you have kids and whether you get a decent living wage. You see, all of that is determined on a system that requires you to memorize for essentially 12 years. However, now again, I'm not poo-pooing the idea. This is just the way it is. Now, when we think of Canadian schooling, right, the education is more student-focused, it's more creative, it's more critical, and it's more collaborative. I've used those terms before in another video, talking about the differences of education between Korea and, or differences between Korea and Canada. So I'll try to remember to link a video to there. So what do I mean by those? Well, go watch the video and go watch the other video, because I don't want to get into that necessarily today. So there is a very different way of understanding the world around us because of the way that we are educated. Now, the way that we are educated is going to factor into our cultural DNA. We are going to see the world in a very particular way because we have either A, learned to memorize a whole bunch of stuff and hopefully get good on a test, or B, being able to understand the world around us in a very different way because we have not necessarily focused strictly on memorization. There is no SAT, for example, in Canada. We don't have to study for some major test. We have other ways of determining whether one goes to university or college, etc. So that is an example of this cultural DNA and how it fits into decision making and understanding the world. Now, how does this then relate to the idea of international marriage? Well, we come to what, not we being whoever is engaged in an international marriage, comes to see the culture and the relationship and the way things are done in particular ways based on what that cultural DNA is. So, for example, in my relationship with my wife, there are clearly certain cultural things that she didn't have to adjust to because she didn't leave the country. Whereas for me, there were adjustments that I needed to make and was aware of those adjustments or the need to adjust because of my own cultural DNA. So I'm trying to think of an example off the cuff. It's hard to come up with a specific example, but actually I'll use teaching as the example because we've talked about that before. I was always frustrated at the very beginning when I was first here because even though I was a certified teacher and I was qualified in Canada and I did a really good job and people liked what I was doing, at least that's what they told me, I was never taken seriously. My ideas were never taken seriously, and I think that had to do with the cultural DNA. First of all, the cultural DNA of Canada is, hey, I'm doing a good job. My ideas are decent and should be recognized. See, that's a cultural perspective of a Canadian education system. However, in Korea, that doesn't exist. First of all, I'm not Korean, so I'm an outsider. And because I'm an outsider, the ideas don't really matter as much because I'm not in the system. Not only that, but you have a junior-senior system in Korea, and my senior Korean teacher is certainly not going to accept junior advice. So there's another cultural issue, cultural DNA coming into conflict because of that. Now, these days, that was a long time ago. That was, 10, 15 years ago. I'm not really worried about that anymore. I understand how the system works. So I'm much less frustrated about it. But certainly at that time, it was something that was very, very disheartening to me. So that's an example. Non-marital, but it's an example of what I mean by that. So cultural DNA, that has a big impact on the way that we talk to each other. It has a big impact on the way that we interact with each other. And how that cultural DNA affects a marriage specifically and generally, and international marriage specifically, I should say, is this. There are certain cultural assumptions that people make in a relationship. When you are coming to a marriage with similar or the same cultural background, you don't need to worry as much about making a mistake in those cultural assumptions because you're pretty sure you know what the other person is thinking. However, if you are coming from two very different cultural backgrounds, you cannot assume that what I'm thinking and what they're thinking is the same. And if you do, you are bound to have problems. Absolutely 100%. Now, those problems could be very small. Those problems could be very big. Depends on what cultural assumptions you're letting slide and you're letting through without actually discussing what those things are in the first place. Yes, arguments can happen because of that. You know what? Arguments are going to happen even if you're in just a regular relationship, so it doesn't really matter. It's just the way things go. So that's the first thing that I want to bring out is this issue of cultural DNA. I think it's an important aspect to consider when you're engaged either in a multicultural relationship or considering marriage. The next thing I want to talk to you about is something way back when I was at university doing my degree in world religions. I happened to take a course in religion and marriage. It's quite a fascinating course, and I took it just kind of to fill in the blanks of my coursework, but actually came to really, really enjoy that course. Now, what did I learn? Well, one of the things that we talked about was, in fact, international marriages or international or multicultural relationships. One of the things I learned was that the divorce rate, typically speaking, is percentage-wise actually higher in a multicultural marriage. And I think that stems in large part from the issue that I talked about first, cultural DNA. However, what's also really fascinating is the other bit of information, the other statistic attached to that. So while it's true that, and mind you, this was 20 years ago, so that might have changed. But at least from what I understand 20 years ago, the divorce rate is a little bit higher than the average. Okay, that's the first thing. But the relationships that survive, the relationships that are past 20 years, 15, 20 years, let's say, the level of happiness in those relationships is much higher than a relationship where two people come to similar cultural DNA. And that, to me, is a really interesting statistic. Now, why is that? Well, I might have some answers for you. Why is it that an international relationship that survives 15, 20, 25 years, where those partners are happier together, why does that happen? Well, the first thing is an international marriage takes more work. Plain and simple, you are putting more effort into the relationship because if you don't, you're dead in the water. There are no cultural assumptions or cultural similarities that you can draw upon. Therefore, everything needs to be talked out. Quite literally, everything needs to be talked out. You need to be able to have that open line of communication where if there's something that's bothering me or there's something that's bothering my wife, we need to feel comfortable and free to bring that up. Because if we don't, we're going to seed that frustration in our bodies, in our minds, much longer, and it's going to fester and create more problems. So that's one area, that's one thing that in terms of the happiness scale, I guess, of international marriages, that's one reason why that happens. It takes more work, and because it takes more work, you talk more about those things. You talk more about the differences and the similarities. And what's fascinating is those things can bring you together in a way that a relationship where you have similar cultural DNA may not. I'm not saying that's always the case. Of course, there are many rules to the exception, but that certainly is one area that you'd need to consider. Now, if you're not a big talker, right? If you're not open to the idea of communication, if you're much more reserved as a speaker, that is going to present a problem for you, I think. I'm not saying that you're not going to be able to do things, but you're going to need to make major personal shifts to bring those things up. Because if you don't, it's going to lead to some problems down the road. So that's another way that this cultural DNA leads into these unique statistics of higher divorce rates and yet higher levels of happiness. And then in those higher levels of happiness, the things that work well work really, really well because the couple works hard at doing that. So I've been going on for 20 minutes now, and I'm going to stop here. But I think this is, I hope that this provides you with a little bit of insight anyway as to the topic. Of course, there are many more things to do. And Muyong, I'm sure you're going to post a comment below. And if there's any kind of follow-up question that you have, by all means, put a comment in the comment section. And I'll take that up again in a video, perhaps next week if I can. We're coming up to final exams next week, so I'm kind of focused a little bit on that right now, but it's okay. So that's me. That's international marriage in a nutshell. I hope you have a great day. Be safe, be healthy, wear your masks that go out and go outside. Don't forget, next week is the final exam. If you got any questions, please send me a text message and I'll be happy to help you out. On that note, as always, be the revolution. Peace, everybody. Take care. See you next week.